My name is Roderick J. Fraser, Jr. I am the commander of the Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, Camp Number 54, Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War in Boston, Massachusetts. I originally grew up in Maine. I'm a graduate of the Maine Maritime Academy, and after graduating from college, I spent the next little over 20 years in the United States Navy as a surface warfare officer. I retired from the Navy, and after retiring, I took up family genealogy. I became very interested in that, and that led me to some of my distant cousins who had told me that our ancestor fought in the Civil War. I had not known that before. When I grew up, I don't recall anyone in the family ever mentioning that. As a matter of fact, my grandfather, his name is George McCluskey, he's still alive, he's 99 years old, and he told me he didn't realize that his great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. So that was an interesting fact that I found out. And after learning that and doing research into his life, that prompted me to join the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And I've very much enjoyed my time in the Sons. I joined in 2016. This is now December 2021. In that time, I've made friends. I've participated in numerous projects that the Sons have done, both locally here in the state of Massachusetts, and also annually we travel out to Gettysburg for Remembrance Day, where we remember all of those soldiers that are buried there and that was killed during the Battle of Gettysburg. I am the great-great-great-grandson of George Alexander McCluskey, who served in the U.S. Civil War in the 1st Maine Cavalry, Company K. Now, George joined the Union Army in January of 1864. He joined in Augusta, Maine. Interestingly, he was not a U.S. citizen. He was born in New Brunswick, Canada, and he was an orphan. So George, when he was 4 years old, his father died in a nighttime boating accident on the St. John River. He drowned. A year later, when George was 5, his mother was murdered by their neighbor and her brother-in-law, a deranged man named William Kerrigan, at supper one night. Kerrigan invited her over for supper and murdered his wife, children, and his sister-in-law. So George became an orphan, and he went to live with we don't know who. So we do know that for a short time he lived in Burton, New Brunswick, because my cousin has a school book that belonged to him that had his name in it and said he lived in Burton, New Brunswick. We don't know who he lived with. We're not really sure when he came to the United States, but at some time he did. And we also know that he was an apprentice shoemaker. He learned how to make shoes, and he was a shoemaker for the rest of his life. Later on in life, well after the Civil War, in 1878, he applied for citizenship, and on those application papers, he stated that he came to the United States when he was 12 years old. But back to his enlistment, George was 17. He was not old enough to enlist, so he lied about his age and said he was 18. At that point, he gave an alias. Maybe he was afraid that he'd be discovered if he gave his real name, so he gave his name as George Alexander, which was his first name and his middle name. When asked about a middle name, he gave the initial E, and he was mustered in as George E. Alexander. He was quickly sent to Warrenton, Virginia, where the rest of the 1st Maine Cavalry was stationed, and he linked up with them, and quickly after arriving, they were thrust into a number of battles. George was part of the Kilpatrick raid into Richmond, also known as the Dahlgren raid, which was a failed attempt to raid Libby Prison and Belle Isle Prison and rescue all of the Union prisoners that were being kept there. He was also at the Battle of Trevilian Station. He was at the Battle of Ground Squirrel Bridge. He was at the Battle of Hawes Shop, at the Battle of Old Church. He was at the Battle of Cold Harbor, and he was at the Battle of St. Mary's Church. Now, at the Battle of St. Mary's Church, he was captured by the Confederates. He was listed as killed in action, with all of his belongings being with the body on the battlefield, but he was actually captured. After capture, he was taken to Belle Isle Prison in Richmond, but shortly thereafter he was transferred to Fort Sumter, which is the actual name of the prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia. Now, most people refer to it as Andersonville. It was a very terrible place to be. 33% of the soldiers there died mostly from disease and malnutrition. Now, George was at Andersonville prison from June of 1864 until November of 1864, when he was transferred to the newly constructed prison in Millen, Georgia. He was there in Millen from November of 1864 until April of 1865, when he was transferred to a hospital in Columbus, Georgia. And he had contracted a lot of illness while in the prison camps, malaria, dysentery, other things. He was very, very ill. But he had the good fortune while he was in Columbus, Georgia, that Columbus was captured by the Union Army. George was then sent back to a Union hospital where he quickly regained his health. And later on, the summer of 1865, he was ordered back to Maine, and he was mustered out of service with an honorable discharge. Now, having spent that time at Andersonville Prison and also the prison in Millen, Georgia, George had a lifetime of health issues. As I mentioned, the malaria and dysentery, these problems plagued him all of his life. And he died at the age of 51 in Brookton, Maine. Now, at the age of 48, he was very ill, and he applied for what was called an invalid pension at the time. He was granted the invalid pension, and he received that pension from approximately the age of 48 years old until he died at the age of 51. Now, we like to think that people didn't live as long back then as they do today, but in this family, people routinely lived into the 80s, so to die at 51 certainly was something that was not common in that family, and this was brought on by all of the lingering illnesses and sicknesses that he received from being basically starved to death and subject to all these diseases while he was in prison camp. After he returned back to Maine, he married, had a family, was a shoemaker. He owned like a general store. He also worked as a barber, and he joined the Joel Haycock Grand Army of the Republic post in Calais, Maine. And he was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic until he passed away. George was initially buried in the cemetery in Brookton, Maine, but in the early 1920s, he was actually disinterred, and he was moved to Stafford Springs, Connecticut, where his wife and 3 of his daughters were living at the time, and they bought a cemetery plot there for all of them, and they buried him in that cemetery plot. So today he's now at Stafford Springs, Connecticut, in the McCluskey plot, along with his wife and his daughters.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. We have loosed the faith